All right, folks, we are going to go ahead and do your lecture. I'm going to get this slideshow started. All right, here we go. So you should be able to hear me. If you can't hear me, you need to turn up your volume. So hopefully you can hear me talking and we can get the volume going here. Let's see if I can get my pen to work on the screen here. There we go. Okay, so if you can't hear me, turn up the volume. I'm here. All right. Feel free to pause the playback anytime that you want. You can speed up the audio, you can slow down the audio, whatever you need um, to make your learning more effective for yourself. Okay? Please keep that in mind. So just before we get started, this whole lecture is all about STEM, like plant stems, not STEM as in STEM science. And I just thought it was cool that I came across this image where there's all of these different vegetables that you can eat that come from the stems. I think when we were doing this in class, we were able to come up with like celery, and then we didn't really come up with anything else, maybe asparagus. But these are all the different things that you can eat. I'm sure there's even more that aren't on here. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the content. There's 4 things that we're going to do today, and some of them are a little bit longer than others, and some of them are pretty straightforward. So we're going to cover the functions of the stem, the types of stems, and the external and internal parts of the stem. And then we're going to call it a day, and I'm going to do the rest on another lecture. So let's start with the first topic, which is the 4 functions of the stems. I think that you should pause the video and with the people around you, like ask them, like, can you come up with these functions? We did this at the very beginning of Unit 4, but that was a long time ago. There's some pictures on here to help you, but go ahead and pause the video and see what you can come up with. All right, I'm assuming that you're back after having a wonderful interactive discussion with your group. And so let's go over it and see what you were able to come up with and what you need a reviewer on. So the first thing is that your stem provides physical support for your plant. So hopefully you were able to come up with that. That might mean holding your plant up off the ground. It might mean helping your plant grow towards the light. It just depends. But physical support is the #1 function of the stem. It also aids in the movement of nutrients and water and those type of things around your plant. The word that's used here on the slide is translocation. We haven't used the word translocation yet, but we're going to start. Translocation is just a very fancy way of saying movement. So trans means movement, like transportation. And location means moving your location. So we're moving nutrients from one part of the plant to the other. You can see that over in the picture here. You've got your water moving and you've got your sugars moving, like we kind of talked about a couple days ago. And then another function of the stem could be to actually store food reserves. So in some stems, they're modified and they store food reserves for the plant. So here we have a cactus. We have a lot of water and a lot of nutrients stored in this stem. And there's some other types of stems that store food reserves too, and we're going to talk about those today. And then the last one is that sometimes the stem can actually be a site of photosynthesis. So especially in a plant like a cactus that doesn't have sort of the traditional leaves that we imagine seeing on like some of the stuff we're growing in the greenhouse, a lot of your photosynthesis would actually occur in the stem. So whenever you see a green stem, you can assume that some photosynthesis is happening there. So those are our 4 functions. All right, we got one thing done. We're going to move on to the second topic of this lecture. The second topic of our lecture is what are the different types of stems? There's actually 3 different types of stems. There's a picture on here just kind of showing you a whole bunch of these possibilities, but we can break them down into 3 categories. We can break them down into herbaceous, woody, and modified. So those are our 3. Before we even look at them, in more detail, I hope that just by looking at the words, you can kind of predict what these stems would be. So with herbaceous, you should see the word herb. So I hope that you're thinking about the herbs that you are growing in the greenhouse, right? What kind of stems do they have? What do they look like? What do they all have in common? Then another type is woody, and hopefully you're just thinking automatically, oh, that must just be like what trees are because they have a lot of wood in them. And then the last one is modified. And I'm hoping that you're like, well, if it's not herbaceous and it's not woody, maybe it's modified. And so let's go through that and see if you're close. So our herbaceous stems um, are standing up because of turgor pressure. So we talked about this in our last unit. When a plant is not getting enough water, it'll lose turgor and it'll actually start being droopy. So all of the plants that we're growing in the greenhouse are currently in an herbaceous stage. Some of them might develop wood later on, much later in their life cycle, but right now everything is herbaceous. So the reason that those stems are standing up is due to internal water pressure. Another way of thinking about this is that these stems are softer. They don't have any bark on them. So there's some spinach and maybe a tomato plant here. For your woody stems, this is going to be just like what you think it would be. It's going to be mostly things like trees and bushes, things that have a more rigid structure on their stem. All of your things that come back from year to year to year, things like the state flower, the rhododendron bushes and blueberry bushes, any type of bush like that that comes back year to year and drops its leaves and leaves little sticks behind, those would be woody stems as well. And the reason that they have a different classification is because they have very rigid cell walls. So they're very different from herbaceous stems. And so we'll talk a lot about trees in the next couple of days because we're going to take a look at what makes their stems so unique. And then the last category of stem type is this modified stem type, which is just a catch-all for everything else. We have 5 different types listed here. I'm sure there's more, but these are the 5 main types. One of them is a bulb. You've probably heard of a bulb before. Here's an example of a bulb. These are onions. So that bulb is actually a modified stem. So when you eat an onion, you're eating part of the stem. This is also stem, and these are leaves, but it's a modified stem that does a little bit of storage of sugars. Another type is a chrome. So here we go. Here's a chrome. This is an example of a chrome. That's taro. So some plants grow these underground stems that are modified stem, and they look like this. And you can actually break these apart to make more of that plant if you want to. We just got a plant that reproduces with chromes from Alpine Nursery, so I can show you that when I come back. Another type of stem, a modified stem, is a rhizome. Ginger is an example of a rhizome. I don't know how often you get ginger from the store, but we get it all the time. And we grate it up and we use it in our cooking, and it adds that wonderful ginger flavor. But you can actually take a ginger plant and this rhizome, and you can put it in the dirt, and it'll sprout and make a beautiful plant because it is a modified stem. And this modified stem will branch out underneath the soil, and that's part of the way that it'll make more ginger plants. Another type is called a runner, which sounds similar to what it's actually doing. Strawberries reproduce this way. So do our spider plants in our classroom. So you have a parent plant, and the parent plant will put out a runner, and the runner will actually create a little baby. And in the right conditions, the baby can become completely separate from the parents. So if anyone's ever grown strawberries before, you've probably noticed that they can be kind of weedy. They can kind of take over if you're not careful because they like to put out these runners. And then our last type here is a tuber, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with tubers because they're pretty common. Things like a potato is actually part of a modified stem. Isn't that interesting? So we again use these for food. We use them in cooking, so there's a lot of energy in that part of the stem. All right, 2 topics down, only 2 left to go. Topic number 3 is our external parts of our stem. This one should go very quickly because we've already covered this as an opener. I want you to know the difference between a node and an internode. So you should probably draw this picture in your notes, and you should probably label it so that you know the parts. So maybe pause the video and make sure that you can define these, and then come back and keep going. All right, I'm assuming that you're back, that you paused the video and you're ready to go. So your node is going to be a place where your leaves grow from. So there's a node, and here's a node, and this actually is also a node. And you can make a cutting by cutting anywhere in between these nodes, and you should, in theory, be able to grow another plant. So if you made a cutting here, you could grow this into a new plant. And when you make that cutting, you're making it at the internode, the space in between the nodes. So you don't want to do your cutting right here. That's bad. You'll actually damage the node and it'll hurt that node and it won't be able to reproduce anymore. You want to make your cutting underneath the node so that you can grow a new plant. All right, that was pretty easy. Here is our last topic. Ooh, that should say a number 4, internal parts. Whoops. So our internal parts. So this is a little bit more complicated. There's going to be a lot of new vocabulary here, and we're just going to do it sort of slowly, so don't panic. We're not going to do it all in this lecture. So everything that you see there up on the slide, eventually you'll know it, but not right this second. So just take a deep breath. But basically our internal parts are going to be made up of xylem and phloem, and how the xylem and phloem are arranged in relationship to one another. And that's going to be different if you're looking at a woody plant versus a herbaceous plant, okay? So remember, these internal parts, these xylem and phloem, are essential for the plant to get its nutrients and its water. And so the way that it's organized is going to be really important. And woody plants are a lot different from herbaceous plants because they grow new living tissue every single year, and the old tissue becomes part of the woody stem, and it's not serving its original function anymore. Okay, so in an herbaceous stem, like the one here on the bottom that's green, everything is living and everything is still doing this original function that it did when it was first formed. But in a tree trunk, which is a modified stem, you're going to not have old xylem serving the same function that it used to. It's not going to be living in the same way that it once was. So for today's lecture, we're going to wrap up by just talking about the internal parts of woody plants, and we'll talk about the internal parts of herbaceous plants later. So that's that green picture on the bottom. We're going to come back to that one in a second part of this lecture. But so for today, we're just going to talk about the internal parts of woody plants. I've listed all the vocabulary words there that I want you to be able to label. So why don't you pause the video and just try? Like, what would you guess is an annual ring? And what would you guess is the bark? And what would you guess is the pith? Kind of sounds like pit, right? And what would you guess is the phloem, sometimes called the cambium in a tree? And what would you guess is the xylem? So just pause the video and see. All right, I'm assuming you paused and you're ready to see the answers. So here are your answers. So if you labeled the outside, this part out here, as the bark, then you got that correct. And if you labeled any of these rings as the annual rings, then you got that correct. The pith is the part in the middle, and we're actually going to talk about that as our vocabulary word today, so we're going to come back to that. And then the xylem and the phloem is where it gets, where you've got to be a little bit more precise. So the phloem is going to be on the very outside, right underneath of the bark. And the xylem will be underneath that. Okay, the xylem will be underneath that. Now, all of this used to be xylem, but as the tree gets older, it turns into wood. Okay. Go ahead and pause the video and make any corrections that you need to on your diagram. So take your time. You don't have to go as fast as I'm going because you can pause me. The last two things I want to talk about on this slide is that you can actually use the xylem tissue, those tree rings, to determine the age of a tree. And that's actually a scientific study, like something you can do. You could grow up and do this. It's called dendrochronology, and that's when you actually study tree rings. And the tree rings will provide a record of what it was like when the tree was growing. And we're going to talk about that in the activity that we do when I come back on Thursday. So congratulations, you did it. You finished this huge lecture. It was very long. You did a wonderful job. Please remember that I do want you to do your reflection on the back. You can either do that now or you can do it at home. Either way, I want these notes in the inbox at the start of class on Thursday. I would love it if you would take it home and interact with them a little bit. Or maybe you do the vocab right now, you put your notes to the side, and then you come back and do your interaction if you still have a lot of time. Remember, it's good for your brain to stop learning, pause, do something else, and then revisit it again because you'll actually remember more in the long run. So please don't forget to do that. So I'm going to keep going on to the next slide. I'm going to show you your vocabulary, and that's all there is from me. So feel free to pause or move forward in the video however you need to get things done today. All right, here is your vocab for the day. We have 3 words. We have herbaceous, which we learned about today. It literally means relating to herbs. And in this case, when we're talking about herbaceous stems, we mean plants with a stem that is not woody. Okay. And then we just talked about dendrochronology. Dendrochronology is the scientific study of using tree ring data. Sometimes we do that to learn about the age of the tree, and sometimes we do it to learn about the place where the tree lived. So what was it like when the tree was growing there, maybe 100 years ago? And then the last one is pith. The pith, by definition, is the soft central part of a stem or a tree. And to me, it kind of it reminds me of pit, right? Like the pit of a fruit. It's very similar to pith, but the pith is actually referring to the squishy inside part. All right, you guys, that's all I have for you. So you can pause the video if you need more time, and you can go back and do your reflection when you're ready. I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.